continues its journey to the west. It sails past the Pillars of Hercules at the Isthmus of Gibraltar and heads south along the Atlantic beaches of Africa between Morocco and Guinea. The Phoenicians were the only people brave enough to venture into the Atlantic. Ancient peoples were terrified of passing the Pillars of Hercules because they believed that beyond lay the end of the world. What was it that pushed the Phoenicians so far? The Greek historian Herodotus documented it in his writings. It was gold. The Phoenicians unload the merchandise and lay it out on the shore. Then they go back on board their ships and send up smoke. The locals see the smoke and place the gold that they are offering in exchange beside the merchandise. Then they withdraw. The Phoenicians descend from their ships and examine it. If they calculate that the quantity of gold corresponds to the value of their merchandise, they take it and leave. Otherwise, they go back to their ships and wait until they are satisfied. The African peoples were very taken with the showy Eastern goods and quite indifferent to the yellow metal that was found in such abundance there. This was the great bargain for the Phoenicians, leaving inexpensive pottery and jewelry and setting off again with gold. The ship would now head north. Excavations in England and Ireland have revealed that the Phoenicians reached even these far-off lands. Numerous finds have indicated that in exchange for pottery and jewelry, the northern peoples gave tin, a metal that was in great demand for producing bronze and the other alloys used by the Phoenicians and Greeks. Ireland was the most northerly landing point for Phoenician voyages, and having traded their goods, the sailors could now make the return journey. The trips always held the portent of danger. In the storms of the North Atlantic, the brave commanders would safeguard their ships and cargoes by tying themselves to the bow so that they could see more clearly and avoid the cliffs. It was from there that they gave instructions to the crew. If they were lucky enough to make it through, they would head south to the Phoenician colony of Cadiz. Here the Phoenicians bought iron and paid for it with gold. Then they traveled on to Majorca, and from there to the rich colonies of Sardinia. It's here that an archaeological dig uncovered a gold mine, not a seam or stratum of gold, but a huge array of precious gold jewelry, now on display in the Archaeological Museum in Cagliari. Since Sardinia has never had gold deposits, the precious metal must have come from Africa on Phoenician ships. In the Sardinian colonies, the Phoenicians themselves worked the gold into the most exclusive forms, modeling it in small molds. Sardinia was the largest producer of Phoenician crafts, especially in the field of glassmaking. They made ointment jars to hold balms and perfumes, necklaces, and characteristic amulets. For centuries, it was believed the Phoenicians invented glass. While science no longer holds with this theory, they definitely were peerless masters in the field of glassmaking. For many years, archaeologists pondered the reason for the ambiguous smile on grinning masks like this one. They also didn't know the reason for the long arms on certain statues. Only after years of research did they find the answers. The masks were used to ward off evil spirits from the tombs. As for the statues, they were related to the more esoteric aspects of Phoenician medicine. They were offered to the gods to invoke a speedy recovery from illness. The affliction to be cured was in the exact spot touched by the hands, almost as if the sick person wanted to remind the gods what needed to be healed. Walls and the sea. A combination like this generally implies that we are dealing with a Phoenician emporium or trading center. The archaeological site of Tharos in Sardinia may not have any large architectural structures still standing, but it is one of the most eloquent when it comes to ancient urban design. Here, Phoenicians would have traded the iron, lead, and part of the tin and gold they had for precious jewels. Tharos was one of the largest producers of jewelry of the period. Among the many Phoenician remains here is a completely extraneous round construction called a nuraghe that was typical of the Pelites, the ancient inhabitants of Sardinia who were conquered by the Phoenicians. This is how the village would have looked about 3,000 years ago. The Nuraghic civilization is very ancient, dating back to the 2nd millennium BC. Their settlements were very compact, with narrow winding streets which made it easier to defend the village from enemy incursions. The houses of the ancient Sardinian people were a combination of fortified towers, granaries, workshops, and dwelling places. There was no distinction made between the function of the various constructions. There was only the nuraghe, a unit where productive and family activities were carried out around a fire, the main focus of the house. But what exactly does the word nuraghe mean? It seems to come from the way their dwelling was constructed. In the ancient local language, nur meant mound. As we can see, the walls of the constructions are thicker than the dwelling area. They were built with heavy stones heaped on top of each other without the use of mortar. The constructions reached heights of more than 65 feet without using any lime, and they are indeed mound-like. Phoenician ports, like this one in Nora, all had something in common. They were situated near promontories. In this way, ships could be moored on both sides of the promontories, creating a larger dock area. The only thing the Phoenicians looked for was to be able to land quickly, get their business done, and then set sail again. These are the foundations of the Phoenician quarter in Nora. Although it's worlds away from the Romans' concept of living, with the Romans preferring large, orderly quarters equipped with many services and amenities, the Phoenicians did share the Romans' love of thermal baths. The baths here in Nora are decorated with rich mosaics. The theater here is also quite spectacular. Dating from the 2nd century AD, it is one of the most fascinating monuments in all of Sardinia. From this Spartan 5th century Phoenician port, the fleet would have set sail again, now laden down with even more jewels and precious objects. One of the greatest archaeological mysteries regarded the port of Carthage, Queen of the Mediterranean, the most powerful of all Phoenician colonies. The Greek historian Appian, a native of Alexandria in Egypt, tells us that the port had 2 harbors, the rectangular commercial port and the round military harbor with an island in the center. However, in modern times, no place seemed to correspond to that description until in the 19th century, the writer René Chateaubriand noticed these 2 lagoons near the bay of Le Cram were very similar in shape to the ports mentioned. He realized that this was Carthage. This discovery led to a heated debate, which was only concluded with excavations carried out in 1974. A British team, excavating on the circular island, found evidence that confirmed Chateaubriand's theory. The bustling port of Carthage was the largest and most modern port in pre-Roman times. Warships would pass from the commercial port through a narrow passage to the military harbor. Merchant ships were forbidden to pass beyond this limit. The ship that is entering the port is a trireme with 3 tiers of rowers, though the Carthaginians also had quadraremes and quinquiremes, which can be compared to modern-day battleships. All the ships returning from war missions, by which Carthage dominated the Mediterranean and protected Phoenician trading routes, were moored in this port. It was circular, with a round island in the center, known as the Island of the Admiralty. There were dry docks both on the island and in the outer perimeter of the port. On the summit of the island was the Pavilion of the Admiralty, from which the Supreme Commander of the fleet gave military orders. A bugler and a herald, armed with flags, controlled the traffic of ships in the port. If a trumpeter signaled to turn left, there had to be room enough to make the maneuver. The basin of water in which the ships moved was thus over 300 feet wide, the same diameter as the Island of the Admiralty on our right. There were 30 berths in the center and 140 on the outside. Since some of the very deep central moorings could hold 2 ships, there could have been 200 ships in the port at one time. The military port in Carthage was always packed in winter, since bad weather made it dangerous for the ships to be out on rough seas. Thus, there was a tendency to avoid war during this time, and this was a good time to service the ships. The trireme would be pulled up onto dry land over the slightly sloping terrain of the island. Planks of wood set crossways ensured that the ships kept their grip on the slipway. At the entrance to the area, Ionic columns set at sea level gave the impression of a portico to make this military site look more elegant. The ships were also given special aesthetic treatment. Phoenician ships typically had an eye painted on the bow that was supposed to strike fear into their enemies. A warship differed from a cargo ship in that it had oars and oarsmen that enabled it to move very quickly. As well as being outstanding sailors, the Phoenicians excelled at shipbuilding. They mass-produced ships and replaced the vessels sunk by their enemies with great speed. All the parts of the ship were clearly marked by different letters and kept ready for quick assembly. In this way, they could build an entire fleet in a short period of time. The busy commercial part of Carthage, however, was the Bursa, the Acropolis of Carthage. This is where the major transactions, the trades and selling of jewelry and glasswork brought from Sardinia, would take place. These goods were in great demand in Carthage. On their way home, the ships might also sail up the Nile to the grand and mysterious kingdoms of the pharaohs. Despite the fact that Egyptians followed the cult of the hereafter, the royalty adored earthly treasures. The Phoenicians would have traded the jewelry from Pharos for linen, a hard-wearing fabric that only the Egyptians knew how to make. This material was indispensable for the robust sails used on Phoenician ships. They might also have purchased rare and exotic goods greatly sought after at the Persian court, namely monkeys and crocodiles. Finally, completing the loop and reaching the town of Tyre, they could sell the exotic animals to the Persians and the linen to their fellow countrymen. They'd be left with gold, silver, and a lot more money than they would have paid for the cedar back in Baalbek. Through their travels and their trading, their ancient wheeling and dealing, the Phoenicians formed links with most of the known world at that time, enabling a variety of peoples to share the best that distant cultures had to offer. The Phoenicians, undisputedly, the master merchants of the Mediterranean.